Three things happened this weekend. A war deal that Iran says doesn't exist the way Trump says it does. 50,000 Americans evacuated from their homes over a chemical tank at a company that was fined nearly $1 million for safety violations and received compliance notices 2 months ago. And the second shooting near the White House in 30 days. On Monday, Iran and the United States both played down hopes for an imminent breakthrough in their 3-month war. The same war Trump announced was largely resolved on Saturday. Let's reconstruct exactly what happened here, because the timeline is important. Saturday afternoon, Trump posted to Truth Social that a deal had been largely negotiated and would be announced shortly. Markets jumped, oil fell. Anchors led with peace. Iran's foreign ministry described what exists as a framework agreement, a first phase, before broader talks within 30 to 60 days on the actual substance. Then came Sunday. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said a framework had been reached, but no one could say an agreement between the United States and Iran was imminent. And then the detail that should have been the lead in every single outlet that covered this. A senior Iranian source told Reuters that Tehran has not agreed to hand over its highly enriched uranium stockpile, adding that the nuclear issue was not part of the preliminary agreement with the U.S. Read that again. The nuclear issue, the stated reason the U.S. went to war, is not part of the agreement Iran says exists. Rubio said there was a pretty solid thing on the table for opening the strait and for Iran entering into a real significant time-limited negotiation on nuclear matters. Time-limited negotiation on nuclear matters. That is not disarmament. That is a calendar invite to talk about disarmament. A senior administration official told CNN that the framework gives the parties 60 days to reach final deal points, and that the unfreezing of Iranian assets will occur only once the Strait of Hormuz has reopened. Here's what is actually being proposed. Iran mines the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. naval blockade cuts off Iran's oil exports. Both sides bleed economically. Then Iran agrees to demine the strait. The U.S. lifts the blockade. Iran gets to sell oil again. And the two sides shake hands and agree to have a serious conversation about nuclear weapons over the next 60 days. The uranium stays in Iran. The enrichment capability stays in Iran. The weapons program that Trump cited when he launched strikes in February remains intact for the duration of the negotiation. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the February 28 strikes. The U.S. and Israel launched those strikes citing fears that Iran was on the verge of nuclear breakout. What the administration is now describing as a framework is the functional equivalent of the 2015 JCPOA that Trump spent years calling the worst deal in history, except without the verification mechanisms, without the multilateral partners, and with Iran's enrichment stockpile at a far higher level than it was in 2015. Republicans who supported the war on the promise of zero enrichment are being handed 60 days of talks. Iran's new leadership is calling enrichment an inalienable right, and Trump is announcing victory on Truth Social. The Strait of Hormuz crisis has driven global energy prices to their highest level in decades. Higher energy prices in the U.S. have been feeding rising inflation, with expectations growing that the Federal Reserve may need to increase interest rates. The administration has every economic incentive to declare peace quickly and every strategic reason to kick the nuclear question down the road. What it does not have is a deal that solves the problem it said it was fighting to solve. While half the country debated whether the Iran deal was real, the other half of Los Angeles was evacuating its Memorial Day weekend. The risk of a catastrophic explosion at a damaged chemical tank in Southern California has been eliminated following a close overnight inspection that confirmed a crack in the tank, relieved pressure, and cooled the chemical. That announcement came Monday morning. 50,000 people spent the holiday weekend away from their homes in Garden Grove and surrounding Orange County communities because of a 34,000-gallon tank of methyl methacrylate at a GKN Aerospace manufacturing facility that began overheating on Friday. Let's talk about what methyl methacrylate actually is and why it was sitting in a residential neighborhood. MMA is a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid used in the manufacturing of resins and plastics, including aerospace components. It's kept stable by a small amount of chemical inhibitor that works only in the presence of dissolved oxygen. When heat consumes the oxygen and depletes the inhibitor, a chain reaction begins, and once it starts, it cannot be stopped. The chemical has a flashpoint of just 2 degrees Celsius. The fire authority said plainly there were 2 options. The tank ruptures and spills 6,000 to 7,000 gallons into the parking lot, or it enters thermal runaway and explodes. The crisis situation forced 50,000 people out of their homes in Orange County for several days. Now, here's what you need to know about this company's history. In 2021, GKN Aerospace paid nearly $1 million to the South Coast Air Quality Management District for several environmental violations, including failing to keep emission records regarding volatile chemical compounds, operating equipment without a permit, and using toxic chemicals in plant operations. That settlement was finalized in early 2025. The violations stemmed from an inspection in 2020. GKN had violated environmental regulations by using chemicals beyond what permits allowed and allowing emissions that exceeded legal limits, while failing to keep complete records and failing to get permits for some equipment or procedures. And then, in March 2025, 2 months before this incident, the company received notices to comply regarding operating records, registration of equipment, and an application for change in ownership of the facility. 2 months ago, the company received compliance notices, and the tank that just forced 50,000 people out of their homes on Memorial Day had a faulty valve that prevented crews from draining it, which is why they spent 4 days spraying water on it and hoping a crack would relieve the pressure. GKN Aerospace is one of the world's largest aerospace suppliers with operations tied to commercial aircraft, military systems, and defense manufacturing. Until this week, most Southern California residents had likely never heard of them, despite the fact that their facility sits amid homes, businesses, and schools. As it happens, about 35 miles from Disneyland. Disneyland, for the record, stayed open the entire weekend. The regulatory system here functioned exactly as its critics describe. Violations were found in 2020. Fines were negotiated over 4 years. A $900,000 settlement was reached. Compliance notices were issued in March. And none of that prevented a cracked, overheating tank of highly flammable chemicals from displacing 50,000 families on a federal holiday. A fine is not infrastructure repair. A compliance notice is not a fixed valve. The gap between paperwork accountability and physical safety is exactly 34,000 gallons of methyl methacrylate and a faulty drain. And then there's this, a detail that is being underreported and should not be. A man was shot dead by U.S. Secret Service officers on Saturday after opening fire on a security checkpoint near the White House, with a bystander wounded in the gunfire. CNN reporters heard what appeared to be dozens of gunshots near the White House shortly after 6 p.m., triggering a roughly 40-minute lockdown. The incident unfolded during a busy day at the White House, where Trump and senior officials were moving in and out of the complex amid ongoing talks over a potential Iran agreement. This is the second major security incident in the vicinity of the White House in 30 days. On April 25th, gunshots were fired near the main security screening area for the annual White House Correspondents Dinner, where a suspect with a manifesto targeting Trump administration officials was arrested. That suspect's written statement described himself as unwilling to permit a pedophile rapist and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes. The manifesto didn't name Trump directly, but the intent was unambiguous. Saturday's shooting was different in method, but similar in pattern. A person who Trump described as having a possible obsession with the White House walked to a checkpoint, pulled a weapon from a bag, and opened fire. Secret Service returned fire and killed him. A bystander was wounded. No officers were hit. 2 incidents, 30 days apart, both near the most heavily protected address in America. I want to be careful here. These are not coordinated. There is no evidence of an organized campaign. But the pattern reflects something that polling and political science have been signaling for 2 years. The level of political rage in the United States has crossed a threshold where individuals with obsessions or grievances are converting them into action. The Correspondents Dinner attacker left a manifesto. Saturday's shooter had an apparent fixation. These aren't random crimes. they're expressions of a political temperature that most mainstream coverage refuses to name directly. Every time a political figure, from any direction, uses language designed to dehumanize opponents or suggest that the stakes of political defeat are existential, that language lands somewhere, not in most people, but in some. And when the Secret Service is dealing with a second major incident in 30 days at one of the most fortified buildings on Earth, the correct question is not, was this an isolated incident? The correct question is, what conditions produced two of them in a month? That question is not being asked loudly enough. Memorial Day, 2026. A war deal that Iran says is missing its most important clause. 50,000 people evacuated from their homes because a company that had been cited for violations 2 months ago stored a thermal bomb next to a residential neighborhood, and a second shooting near the White House in 30 days. These three stories don't share a cause, but they share a structure. Warning signs that existed, were documented, and were not acted on with sufficient force to prevent the outcome. The Iran nuclear timeline has been known since 2015. GKN's violations were filed in 2020. The political temperature that produces checkpoint shootings has been rising openly for years. We don't have a shortage of warnings in this country. We have a shortage of consequences for ignoring them.